teachers with different characteristics. How are they allocated to schools? What kind of practices are being used in different schools? And including issues around technologies. What makes this data source special is that we have a comparative perspective. You can look at the UK through a kind of comparative lens, covering over 50 countries. And very important, we have direct data from teachers, which tell us something about teacher quality, which is very, very hard to get in a kind of national context. And we obviously put a lot of focus on digital learning, which was so important during the pandemic. And we look at this through two lenses. First of all, is equality. Do resources get equally allocated to students? And then through an equity lens. Do we match resources with needs? And both lenses, I think, are quite relevant. So let me just sort of give you a sense of the results. The first question is, do we allocate resources equally? And I just pick sort of 6 dimensions here. The first relate to the kind of teacher characteristics, and then the last 3 to what teachers actually do. And if you are at 0, it basically means that teachers are perfectly equally distributed throughout the school system. If you are at 1, it's not here on the chart, but you extrapolate the scale, basically it means that all great teachers are in one single school. So basically that is the range of the spectrum here. And I can start out with the country that did worst, or the most unequal one. And there you can see, for example, the experienced teachers are all very concentrated in specific schools. Teachers with a comprehensive formal education, sort of teachers who've passed through all the levels of education, are concentrated. Teachers in the top quarter, judged by their self-efficacy, their own judgment on the use of effective practices, are highly concentrated. You can see teachers who use cognitive activation processes that we know are associated with better outcomes, are highly concentrated, and so on. So you can basically see in some countries there's a high level of concentration of specific teachers. The average looks better, but still you can see teachers generally are quite unequally allocated. If you look at England, it's a pretty typical country, close to the average. The one area where it's doing better than the average is that the concentration of teachers with more than 10 years of teaching experience is less extreme. At the same time, you don't have so many teachers with 10 years of experience. So that's also maybe a more logical outcome. But I think sort of pretty typical. So not dramatically bad, not dramatically good on the third countries doing better than this. If you look at the kind of minimum value, it doesn't get perfectly equally distributed, but it gets sort of pretty close to the 0 point. So huge variability, and I do think this is encouraging because it just tells us that this is not an outcome of education. This is something that we can work on through good incentive structures and support to align teachers with resources. Now, an equal distribution of teachers is not necessarily what you want. No, it's very important also to think about, how you move from equal allocation to equitable allocation. But actually, there things get more difficult. Now, when you look, for example, in most countries, the experienced teachers, by those I mean, people who have taught for more than 10 years, we're using this indicator because there's a lot of research supporting that experience does count. Experienced teachers tend to sort of produce better outcomes, and you can see that actually in most countries, including England, those experienced school teachers end up in the more disadvantaged schools. So that's, I think, something that most education systems need to work on. It is easier to get more teachers into disadvantaged schools. No? Many countries have devices to assure that. Class sizes are often smaller in disadvantaged schools. But as you can see here, to get the experienced teachers to teach in a tougher school is much harder. We also see that those experienced teachers are often more likely to be in a private sector. But that's something where you can see actually sorry, this is actually the opposite. Experienced teachers are more likely to work in public schools, but for England, you can see that's basically not visible. That's basically something which works out quite well. So those are the two areas where things are unequal. Particularly, I think the experienced teachers, allocating them to disadvantaged schools, I think, is a priority for most countries, as you've seen. There are other areas where we don't find so much of a difference. When you ask yourself, for example, comprehensively trained teachers. So these are teachers who've passed, all stages of formal teacher development. There you can see, yes, slight differences. But this is just the number of countries where you can see there is a visible, advantage for disadvantaged schools and advantaged schools. But more or less, it is quite equal. Also, public and private schools. Yeah, there are a few countries where public schools have more comprehensively trained teachers, but the difference is not so strong. And also you can see, when you look at urban and rural schools, when it comes to teacher training, that's not so much an issue. Most countries have quite good regulatory frameworks in place that ensure that every teacher who is employed has a kind of comprehensive training. In the case of England, in fact, it's included in the group of countries which where the disadvantaged schools have a higher share of comprehensively trained teachers. So I think that is something that most countries seem to be getting right. When it comes to self-efficacy, now again, that's the belief of teachers that they're using effective teaching practices. Also there you can see the differences are not very pronounced. And when I don't show you England, basically it means that there's no statistically significant gap. And you can see for most countries, there are a few countries teachers has higher self-efficacy on disadvantaged schools, few where they are in advantaged schools, but more or less it's not very big, the difference. And the same, I think, for school governance and school location. So that's, again, I think also quite good news. The kind of confidence that teachers have in their own abilities seems to be quite universal, quite equally distributed. So that's basically those self-related belief. Now comes the practices. And this, I think, where things get most worrying. When you look at the teachers who maximize instruction time. By this, I mean, when you have classroom time, we subtract all the time that is, wasted because of disciplinary issues or administrative issues or all sorts of things. And we look what ends up to be used for real, instruction. And there you can see basically in virtually every country, teachers who are very good at using the time effectively for instruction tend to be overrepresented in the schools from privileged neighborhoods. That may not be all attributable to the teachers. They may also have the easier students to deal with and therefore spend less time with kind of discipline issues. So there may be lots of reasons behind it, but the net reality is that students from disadvantaged backgrounds get less teaching time, less effective teaching time. And that's the bottom line that really counts. Whether it's the fault of the teacher or the fault of the context, the reality is if you come from a disadvantaged background, you end up with less teaching time. And I think this is one of the most kind of significant findings here, because that's the only resource that actually matters for learning. What amount of teaching time do you actually have? But again, you can see that gap varies quite a bit across countries, which shows again that this is not a universal, inevitable kind of phenomenon, but one that we see in some countries very, very pronounced. And what is also important is that research really shows that this is one of the most impactful findings when it comes to student learning outcomes. We also see that private schools seem to be better in maximizing instruction time. Again, whether it's attributed to the teachers or to their more advantaged context is open to debate. We don't have that disentangled here, but it is clear, again, you're in a private school, you end up with more effective instruction time. On other variables, where it comes to sort of teaching practices like teachers' use of cognitive activation practice, now this is again something that research shows where teachers use those practices, students typically learn better. Now that's basically something that research shows, and there you can see the differences are not very pronounced. There are a few countries where advantage schools have higher shares of this type of teachers, but it's just 4 countries. Then also by school governance, we don't see a big advantage of private schools here, and also not a big advantage of city schools, just a few countries where these differences are significant. So again, I think you can rely on teachers using those practices quite across the school system. And this is important because, of course, the teacher characteristics are ones that people carry with them. But what they do is something that depends on the school context, on the leadership, and you can see it seems that most schools sort of put an equal emphasis on those kinds of practices. Clarity of instruction is another of those variables that research shows, it's a great predictor for learning outcomes. Now, where teachers, set out clear objectives, they provide, good direct instruction and those kinds of things. And there you can see also here, not actually a big issue. Few countries where disadvantaged schools have more of those teachers. It seems to be more prevalent in the public school systems in a number of countries, but I wouldn't call those differences. And then you're also in city schools. But you can see it goes either way. So we don't see a clear kind of objective pattern of that. Let's move on to digital learning resources. Obviously, during the pandemic, that's been a kind of key importance here. And there are a number of points I just wanted to show here. First of all, students who attend public schools tend to have more limited access to adequate technology equipment. How do I know? Because we asked principals basically, to what extent do you think learning is hindered by the lack of digital resources? And remember, this is data from before the pandemic, but you can see in most countries those bars goes clearly down. For England, you can't say that. Actually, I think that's a positive sign here, that technology seems to be quite, universally spread through the system pre-pandemic. But in general, you can see that principals in disadvantaged schools feel access to technology to be a greater bottleneck. So that's the first digital divide still exists. I think this is what this is telling us. Now, probably not anymore the most dominant divide. I think the second digital divide, and to what extent are technologies effectively used, and to what extent are students acquiring the skills related to this. That's a much bigger issue, but you can see even equipment is still, in the eyes of school principals, a quite important factor. We also see that's the urban-rural divide. That's probably more known, that basically in rural areas often technology is more of an issue than in cities. I think that's no surprise. It's probably not just in the school sector, but quite everywhere. And when you look at the countries where that is not the case, on the right side, these are usually very small and very urbanized countries. In Belgium, you don't find so many rural areas. So when you look at actually the equality and the distribution of resources, now before I look to equity, let's just see to what extent there is some clustering of teachers. And again, you can see in green, England is actually a very typical country. Comes out where the dotted line is, not something that we can see. And you can see when it comes to teachers who had formal training in the use of technology for teaching, most countries do quite well. That is, that kind of teaching resources, the teacher training is quite equally spread through the system. I think that's good news. Teachers who participate in professional development, that's more unequally distributed. I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Teachers with a high degree of self-efficacy in the use of technology, that's where things get worse. And I think that's really important. You can see the training is similar, but when it comes to actually, do I think I can make some use out of that? You see suddenly there is inequality. So you can see teachers have passed through the same kind of course, but when it comes to their perceived effectiveness, things get more unequal. And you can see also teachers who use technology for teaching on a regular basis, you can see much greater kind of disparities across the system. But once again, equality is not equity. So let's look at the kind of equity picture. And here's coming an interesting picture. You can see, for example, England belongs to the countries where actually teachers with training in technology are more likely to be in disadvantaged schools, which is a good thing. You know, you want those trained teachers in the disadvantaged schools. I would to be quite careful in how to interpret this. It's made simply a factor of, you know, the age distribution. Basically, you have younger teachers better trained in technology, and the younger teachers end up in the more disadvantaged schools. So I think, you know, I wish we could allocate this to a deliberate intentional public policy, but most likely it's an outcome of simply, you know, experience of teachers. Then the incoming cohort of teachers obviously is much better equipped to use this technology. You know? You can also see England is among the countries where public schools have generally higher shares of teacher of training in the use of technology, and rural schools. But once again, I think this is very much an experience phenomenon. Most likely, I can't prove that, but I think that's my interpretation of those kinds of data. So, but overall, you don't find many countries on the extremes. In most countries, basically, you can say that educations do quite well in equipping teachers or distributing teachers with formal training throughout their kind of systems now. A bigger issue is what do you do once they're in the system? To what extent are teachers, you know, continuing to learn, to upgrade their skills, the continued professional development, particularly, you know, in a situation like a pandemic, nobody could have trained you before that. We didn't know it would come, no, but are you capable actually to sort of grow in your own work? This kind of continued professional development really, really is important. And there you can see there is in most countries, teachers in privileged schools have better opportunities. You can also see in private schools, teachers have better opportunities. And remember, that's interesting. You look at the people who got training before they got to school, and you could see actually generally public schools are an advantage. And there's no big gap between advantage and disadvantage. But when it comes to what do those teachers experience once they are in their school, there you can see that students or teachers in privileged schools tend to do get more of those professional development. So schools in advantaged contexts tend to do more to upgrade their teacher skills. So I think that's really, I think, and it's also a pattern that we observe in the case of England. When it comes to teachers with high degrees of self-efficacy in ICT use, you can see they tend in many countries to work more in a private school sector. For England, that difference is not really statistically significant, but in a majority of countries, you can say that's the pattern that we observe. And then you can see also when you look at technology use, you can see generally private schools seem to be better in getting teachers to use technology more actively. And again, that may relate to also them investing more in the continued professional development of their teachers. This is a sort of what we call the intra-class correlation. That is the degree to which there are differences among schools. And you can see basically when you account for teacher and school characteristics, including the infrastructure, you subtract all of this. How do you use what you have? You can see there's quite a bit of variation in school systems, and that includes England as well, in the kind of use of technology infrastructure. We know from research how important teacher collaboration is, teacher professional collaboration. Pandemic is again a good illustration. You know, in that moment, depended a lot whether you have access to kind of people around you who can help you learn, and you can see that teachers who engage in professional collaboration are more likely to be regular users of ICT for teaching. Not surprisingly, but it's important to see that the more opportunities schools provide for teacher professional collaboration, the more likely you're going to see your teachers. And that's probably not just true for technology, but for most modern kind of practices, because we know from research that this is how teachers learn often best through the kind of professional networks. But in the case of technology use, it's quite clearly visible. So the last point I really want to make is try to answer the question whether all of this makes really a difference in terms of student learning outcomes. And obviously that's very hard to answer. All I can do on this is really square the results from TALIS on what teachers do with the results from PISA, where we actually know something about equity in the distribution of learning outcomes. So what you're going to see is simply a cross-country correlation of those two dimensions. Now, we know very little about the causal nature of those interrelationships, but the patterns in itself are really quite interesting to see. I'll help you a bit how to read this. Now, basically, when you are here, disadvantaged students score higher in learning if you're up, so you want to be up. Disadvantaged students score lower in learning when you're down. And then here you can see on the left side a more even distribution of experienced teachers, and on the right side less even. You can see across countries those things do correlate. So disadvantaged students tend to do better academically when experienced teachers are more evenly distributed across schools. So the cross-country correlation confirms education systems that do a better job in distributing their teachers more evenly tend to have, fewer low performers in a nutshell. Whether those things are causally related or what's cause and effect is not something that we can talk about. What you can clearly see is, you do a better job in distributing your teaching resources better, and you're likely to see lower share of poor performers. Second, you can see the same thing when it comes to comprehensive formal education. Now, the vertical axis is the same. Now, you want to be basically high up where your disadvantaged students do really well. You can see, for example, systems like Singapore, Shanghai, Estonia, Finland, Alberta in Canada. Now, those are systems where basically even the most disadvantaged students come out really, really well. And you can see there are also the systems in general where there is a more even distribution of comprehensive trained teachers. So again, a pretty clear cross-country relationship with a correlation that is statistically significant. The use of teaching practices. If you are doing a better job in maximizing your instruction time, if you have a more even distribution, you're on the left side, you can see fewer disadvantaged students. That's probably not so, it's quite intuitive. Basically, we know how important, again, the use of effective instruction time is. And when you allocate your teachers more evenly and more equitably, you see fewer lower performing students. Here I look at something slightly different. It's no longer sort of the share of performers. Here I look at the relatively less in opportunity. This is basically relatively more opportunity for disadvantaged students when it comes to learn digital literacy skills. And you can see also there clearly that disadvantaged students tend to have more opportunity to learn digital literacy skills when teachers with high teacher self-efficacy are more evenly distributed. That's, again, not much of a surprise. Now, if you have access to those teachers throughout the system, your disadvantaged students are more likely to benefit from this. I leave you with the chart that is hardest to understand. And that's actually, we see that experienced teachers to be more evenly distributed in countries where there is a greater degree of school autonomy. Some people would have predicted the opposite. Now, you give schools a lot of flexibility in hiring their own teachers, and then, the great schools are going to attract the best teachers, and there will be more uneven distribution of teachers. But what these data clearly show is that the front line seems to be quite good in actually matching resources with needs better than the systems that allocate centrally. Now, the line is quite clear in that. Again, it's a cross-country correlation, and you can see England at the end where schools actually have a fair degree of school autonomy, and you can also see it is among the countries there's a more even distribution of experienced teachers. Now, so it seems that higher degrees of school autonomy does not, amplify the inequalities in the distribution of experienced teachers, but it seems to be quite a good thing to do. Just, wrapping up, basically, what you can see, what we can do is basically, first of all, ensure is that all schools have the capacity to recruit and retain effective teachers. And I think that's an obvious kind of conclusion. But how to achieve this? Again, I think these instruments like the pupil premium are a good example. You give schools resources, but then you need to incentivize and support them to use those resources to focus on quality. And I think this is the hard part where probably England can do even better to ensure. And this is not just, some people say, oh, it's all about, pay. It's not just about making teaching in those schools financially more attractive. It's more about, giving them access to good resources, good support, good colleagues, all of those things that actually matter for people to work in a more difficult, more challenging environment. And as you could see, some countries do really well on this. No? The criteria for recruitment and transfers of teachers, I think this is something that, and that's probably, the last point on the autonomy. When everything is just done by seniority, often what happens that, the experienced teachers end up in the easy to teach school and the young teachers get to the most disadvantaged schools. That's where actually the school autonomy can actually counterweight those kinds of systems that are doing this in a very centralized way, I think. But again, looking at the criteria for recruitment and transfers is really, really important. No? And I already highlighted, supporting teachers who work in difficult conditions really well, I think is absolutely important. When you look at the education systems that are most equitable in their distribution, you find them in Northern Europe, you find them in East Asia. Basically they do a lot actually to make sure that teachers get all the support they need. They get the professional development, they get, the resources, they get, the infrastructure and so on. And those things actually matter at least as much than just the kind of financial compensation. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Andreas. Is this mic working okay? Perfect. A really helpful and informative overview there of the report. Lots for us to take away. We're going to have about 5 minutes or so for questions specifically to Andreas. But Andreas, I think you are now joining us for the panel discussion as well. So there will be more opportunity to hear from him too. So does anyone have any questions in the audience for Andreas? And we can get a microphone to you. Gina at the front and the back, please.
Hi, good morning. Great. Hi, Andreas. Thank you so much for that. I loved that it really tied in with what Andy was saying about a holistic education, so attainment and skills, and you were looking at the correlation for those. One of the areas I'm really curious about is well-being as well, given the implications of COVID and exacerbating that. I'm curious, what does the report cover that at all, or do you want to share any findings from your own perspective, given your research?
And we'll take the one at the back. Thank you.
Yeah, John Bangs, Education International. Can I thank you for that, Andreas? And I think it's a really, really vital report. Education International, along with the OECD and a range of other global organisations, have been focusing on how you actually increase support for disadvantaged schools consistently and on the issues of teacher policy. And I think this is a very, very good summation. What I find is a rather unfortunate irony is that this report, vital as it is being launched in the UK when the English government has withdrawn from TALIS. And I notice, incidentally, on the cast list today, there isn't a single person here from the department. I think TALIS is absolutely vital. There's a very important statement inside TALIS which says that there is shed loads of research which links teacher self-efficacy with student outcomes. I would like to know, Andreas, from you, how important do you think, given the existential crises that kids are facing and the levels of anxiety, TALIS is in the future and whether or not you think that the UK should rejoin TALIS.
Thank you. So, a question there about well-being and the importance of TALIS.
Yeah, the question about well-being is an interesting one. In fact, we could answer this. The reason why we choose academic performance, because that's where we have metrically comparable results. For well-being, we have only the kind of self-perception of young people, but we can do in principle the same picture. The one caveat I want to make is that actually well-being and academic performance are more closely related than you imagine, actually, and that's, I think, something we shouldn't forget. In a few countries where this is different, you can go to Korea, where, you know, academic performance is high and well-being is low. But for most, there are few exceptions to this pattern, but for most, actually, they're surprisingly closely related at both individual and aggregate level. So, but it's certainly an analysis that after this pandemic, we should pursue, and we can based on the data. We have actually the PISA provides now a quite rich set of indicators on students' well-being. We look at, you know, from life satisfaction up to, you know, sense of belonging in school, the social environment, the quality of student-teacher relationship, which, by the way, when you look at well-being, is the strongest predictor of student well-being. The quality, the student's perception of the quality of teacher relationship. So I think a very interesting point, but again, you can assume that what you could see here for academic performance will broadly hold also on the student well-being. On the UK withdrawal from TALIS, it's obviously a decision that governments need to make. And personally, I believe actually these are some of the most important data that we have at the OECD, because we can look at teachers through the system, you know, how many people do we employ, what the salaries are, the working time. But TALIS is really about the perspective of the profession. And it's very, very rare to get that. And we believe that, you know, the truth in education is about triangulation. You know, we need to get the student perspective and the student outcomes. We need to understand, you know, the barriers and perceptions that teachers have about the work. And we need to understand the system. And you put all of those together and you get an understanding of education system. So I do believe without a good picture of the teacher voice and the teacher perception, I think it's going to be very hard to develop better policies.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one for Andreas. If we go to the lady at the back, please.
Hi, thank you. Anna Searle, Education Development Trust. I just want to pick up on the point about well-being, because we have started some research with UNESCO around the school reopening in Rwanda and Kenya, and it's quite surprising. So when the students were asked, did they feel more supported and cared for after the COVID-19 disruption, 77% in Kenya said yes, 33% in Denmark said yes. So some of the things around well-being are really critical to the engagement for those disadvantaged students. And when we have more of the research, I think when we finished it, I think it's going to be really informative on the point about well-being, engagement, and therefore educational outcomes.
Yeah, you know, I think I would say that even applies more generally. I think the pandemic has really, you know, pushed us to look at well-being through a new lens. We've always looked at this as a kind of byproduct of schooling, and actually what you could see during the pandemic, that it becomes, you know, primary driver. You know, if students do not have, you know, that sense of purpose, that sense of well-being, it's going to be very hard to get them to learn when they're not under the kind of environment of a school. Now, I also think, you know, now after this pandemic, you're going to have many young people going to go back to their teachers, you know, looking for how, you know, learning can be differently. And I think you could see many teachers who've discovered, you know, it's not enough to be a great instructor. You have to be a great coach, a great mentor, a great facilitator, a great social worker, a great psychologist. And I think that awareness clearly is much more present. Whether the results are going to be different, I think that's something that we need to see when we get our next service.
Thank you so much, Andreas. And I'm really sorry if we haven't got time for your question right now, but Andreas will be staying for the Q&A part of the panel. I've just also been informed by my team that while the DFE aren't here in person today, they are tuning in via the live stream. So they are hearing the findings from the report and they'll be listening in to the debate. So let's move on to that panel now. And I'm going to introduce my colleague, James Zaccolo, who's the Director of School Workforce in EPI. So James, do you on the panel want to take your seat and then you'll introduce the panel? Thank you so much.
Well, while everyone gets settled, shall I introduce everyone? We have a very exciting panel here today. We have a range of expertise, of UK expertise, international expertise. You probably know them all, and they're nigh on household names to an audience like this. But we're just going from my right here. We have Russell Hobby. He leads Teach First, one of the biggest teacher ITT providers in the country. They do CPD. They're expanding out into more things, and he also came from outside teaching, which makes him slightly an unusual leader in education, but a really interesting perspective he can bring from his prior experience. Sufyan Sadiq, he leads the teaching school at the Chiltern Learning Trust, and he runs CPD and ITT across many, many schools. Andy, well, I think you've met Andy already, but Andy brings experience from so many different sectors to this. I think that's a really interesting perspective, because so often in education, we focus on what's going on in education in England. I think bringing those other perspectives here, as Andreas has done, so valuable. And then Julie Belanger here, she's the director of Better Purpose, and she's previously done research and leadership at ARC, at the OECD, working on TALIS itself, and has particular expertise in international education in developing nations. So an international perspective, and of course, Andreas, you've just heard from. So what I've asked our panelists to do is first give us just a few minutes of their reflections on the presentation and the report, and then we will go to audience questions. So have your hands ready. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time and give them to the panelists who have the deepest expertise in the area, and I hope we should get about half an hour for your questions. So should we go the other way round from the way I introduced you and start with Julie?
Should I use this mic? Thank you, James. Thanks. Really nice to be here. I have to say, it's nice to be in person, my first in-person panel since the before times, which is quite nice. I think the question I'd like to start off, and I only have 3 minutes, but one of the reflections that I've had, and very briefly flipping through the pages of this report, one of the questions, James, you posed to us is, why do teachers prefer to teach in better off schools? And we've seen that this is happening in many, many countries. And I think a lot of the research that I've been experiencing through TALIS and internationally points to the importance of working conditions and classroom climate and school climate in particular. And I want to highlight a study that went a little bit under the radar last year that came out from my former colleagues at RAND Europe, and they used a discrete choice experiment to survey teachers, and they collaborated with TeacherTapp and NFER as well on this study. And with this discrete choice experiment, what they did is they asked numerous teachers on a survey hypothetical scenarios, pitting them against each other to look at essentially try to quantify the relative importance of what teachers value, what motivates them, what makes them want to go, and teach and stay in the profession. Is it pay? Is it working condition? Is it career progression? And I think what the research shows is actually there's a huge value set on behavior, on classroom climate, on school climate, and that actually there's a lot of teachers who are willing to trade off pay for being in a supportive environment. And that finding actually resonates throughout all of the TALIS, analysis that we've done. The TALIS that I was involved in looked at how student behavior was really, really closely linked to teacher job satisfaction and self-efficacy, even more so than class size. So that actually, what teachers do in the classroom with behavior is more important. How much time they spend managing students' behavior is more important than class size. And the other important piece of information that goes into this is that there's a protective effect of having positive in-school relationships, right? So if you have good relationships with your colleagues, with the school leader, with your students, you can actually minimize that negative relationship you see between negative behavior and efficacy, self-efficacy and job satisfaction, and also collaborative practices. So if you increase collaborative practices and collaborative learning, you see that protective effect. And so I guess where can we have the big difference at a system level for improving quality for all of the students? I think there's something to be said about what happens in the school and how you create that climate. A lot of the variance that you see in teacher practices is actually seen within schools, that there's a much larger in-school variance. It's 80 to 90% in terms of practices of the variance that's within school as opposed to between schools. And so what that says is there's pockets of excellence in every school, essentially, right? So there's good practices, good teachers in every school. And why not leverage that to support those teachers who are new, who are struggling, who, and so you have the resources there as well. So at the policy level, at the central level, how can we, I guess, support, enable, make sure that the schools have the empowerment to be able to do that, to allow those kinds of collaborative practices and support to be happening in the school. So for me, it's about trying to look at what's happening in the school as well. Not to say that the central policies are not important, but that variation that we see in teacher practices, it's very small when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. So those are my initial reactions.
And how can we do this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what Andreas was talking about the school autonomy. Part of that is that, but of course, it's a culture change, right? It's being able to open. We said this. I think Kristen is here in the audience as well. And one of the main messages we came from TALIS 2013 is we need to open the doors of the classroom. Stop thinking about a classroom being something with one teacher in front of a group of students that are staying there on their own. It's not. And the more you're going to open those doors of the classroom and allow, collaboration and support to happen within the school, I think the closer we are at supporting all the students.
Fantastic. A policy recommendation already. Andy.
Thank you. Firstly, I would agree with everything that was just said. A few thoughts for me on the report. A lot of it feels very intuitive, and that's good because we like it when the obvious is something we can execute upon. What was in part interest for me was the digital angle, and that was interesting for me that Andreas didn't pull out the digital policies that you can also draw from the same sets of data. For me, it is self-evident that what we need to do is to make sure that learners globally have access to the internet, because if you haven't got access to the internet, you can't access a digital environment. Secondly, it's self-evident that we need to make sure that when you're accessing a digital environment, you get access to great teaching. Thirdly, it's clear that you need great digital content. And when you have those things together, you can make a really significant impact on learner outcomes, and we could see that through the data that we were presenting. So for me, that's a really exciting opportunity, actually, because it's becoming so much more possible to provide digital access at affordable prices globally than it has ever been before. The rollout of 5G technology, but also satellite-based internet connectivity, is really shifting the paradigm in terms of access to internet globally, and that's going to really help in addressing the rural dynamic that Andreas highlighted. So some very interesting things happened through COVID. The first, and if I just speak for my own FE college, the first thing that was a surprise was just how quickly our teachers adapted to delivering classes online, much more quickly than I would have expected, and we probably shot forward a decade in the space of about 6 weeks. So really quite surprising. Second thing that was very surprising was some of our students actually performed much better in a digital environment than they did in a physical environment. That was particularly true of some of those students who had social problems or social engagement problems. So that there is something in that we must not lose as we come out of the pandemic, recognizing that a blended environment is actually probably more powerful than a pure classroom-based environment. But we also mustn't lose the jump forward that we made in terms of using digital tool sets to engage at a very individual and personal level with students. You can do different things when you are supported with a digital environment. But to make all of that work, we've really got to focus on the CPD. And one of the things that really struck me as we were listening to the report was actually just how significant the continuous professional development is, because you may come out of your initial teacher training being really up to speed, but with the rate of change of what's happening in digital learning, you're probably completely out of date 4 years later. So I think it's become more important than ever.
Wow, man, he does a lot of CPD.
I'm going to put a timer on because I definitely don't want to let go of the mic once I get hold of it. So I think the things that really stood out to me, being on the kind of cold face of things, being a multi-academy trust director, but also stuff I do in my own personal time really allowed me to connect with this. I'm a founder of a food bank in Luton. I'm also a founder of a uniform charity in Luton. We provide weekly soup kitchens in and across Luton. And some of the issues that we're seeing around inequity and the growing inequity in society are going to only become exacerbated through what we're seeing at the moment. The energy crisis will make the poor poorer, significantly poorer than we can imagine. Thinking about the equity issue around diversity, I do a lot of work around diversity, very similar to the way good teachers, do they actually congregate around good or affluent schools, or do good teachers gravitate towards other good teachers? Because what we're finding is there's more black teachers in schools where there are other black teachers, and more Asian teachers in certain pockets in the country where there are other Asian teachers. So how do we bring about that equity within the system? We have providers. I'm glad Russell's here because they're kind of the pioneers in actually trying to get really high performing teachers in really challenging schools, because actually that's where the real issue is, the equity of teacher development. We're looking at the equity of pupil outcome and pupil performance, but we're almost assuming that there's an equitable system of teacher development across the system, that if you somehow develop as a teacher in location A, you're going to be as good as a teacher developing in location B. We know that's not true. So is it about looking at some of the more poorer areas and really bringing about some of the stronger teacher providers in those areas to develop stronger, more resilient teachers that can manage in those contexts? Do they need different development? If we know that behavior is an issue where there's greater number of disadvantaged young people in schools, do you bring about more specialisms around behavior? Incentivizing teachers, I think the point about Sweden and what they do around incentivizing teachers, we've talked about the pupil premium model, incentivizing the schools, but does that incentivize the end person who's at the cold face of things, dealing with the challenge? So do we look at a model and a system that allows us to incentivize those at the front? We've talked about autonomy, and autonomy is a real challenge for me, because I think autonomy is great, but we also need to remember that within our system, I'm increasingly looking at rich school versus poor school dynamics that are occurring. Some schools that tend to perform really well, that have really good systems embedded, tend to perform a lot better on outcomes. Schools that are not performing well on outcomes are also not performing in financial management and other aspects of operational management of that school. So schools tend to get poorer on one side, richer and more effective on one side. When they're poorer, they can't afford the teachers that they need at the right level and stages of their careers that they need. So is there an issue around giving wholesale autonomy? Is there a challenge around that? I don't know what the answer is, but I know that we see the problem of autonomy within the system, whether that's local authority or multi-academy trust. I don't think it's really an issue on one or the other. I think there's an issue on both. School performance, again, and that was the last thing that really stood out to me when I was thinking about this. Schools that perform really well. The problem we have is when you're looking at a difficult school, and I think the point was made about well-being of pupils, but also the well-being of staff. If you're looking at really high-performing schools, you're thinking my life will be better here, and systems are in place and structures are in place and processes are in place, less behavior management, and the impact on teacher well-being cannot be, again, disconnected from the way we look at the advantage and disadvantage and where schools perform better and where they don't perform better, because a happy teacher, a healthy teacher is a better teacher, which then if we know stronger and better teachers make better results, then we know that actually investing in the well-being of teachers has to be a step we really look at in seriousness, and not a gimmicky thing that we keep talking about in well-being, but actually if well-being should be looked at in the lens of direct impact on performance and outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. And I know there are people here who work quite closely on staff wellbeing, who I'm sure have questions about that, and some serious challenge to the points about autonomy as well. I might, after Russell, come to Andreas to respond to some of those, because I know you've done a lot of work on that, the OECD previously. Russell.
So I think one way of framing this is not that teachers don't want to teach in schools serving disadvantaged communities, but they can't teach increasingly over time. I know there are lots of people who join the profession with a view to teaching in schools serving disadvantaged communities, and I know that on Teach First that if I tried to place some of my people in an affluent school, they'd walk off the programme. Teachers become teachers to make an impact and to do something worthwhile, and there is nowhere, there are few places you can do more worthwhile than schools and serving communities who are otherwise lacking in resources as well. The question, I think, is not the motives of the teachers, but what we do to the teachers once they arrive in these schools and how they are increasingly burnt out by what is going on there. And I think the TALIS data points us in an interesting direction that, of course, the overall level of workload is important. There's a certain limit to the number of hours you can work in a day and still be fresh for the next morning. But it's also the nature of the work that I think is incredibly important. And that what burns out teachers is a growing sense that they're unable to spend their time with the pupils, making a difference to the pupils, or that the things that they do with their students are frustrated and confounded by other things going on in the school. It's the lack of self-efficacy, which I think becomes important there. And there are many factors contributing to this. I do think that behaviour issues are one. If you're unable to devote time in the lesson to the things that you plan to do, that can become increasingly frustrating. But I think that school policy and government policy can also play significant roles on this. If we're asking teachers to spend significant amounts of time on bureaucracy and administration, for example, if we're constantly changing initiatives, so you've invested time developing skills in one area and then you have to change and go off to another, increasingly you just don't feel that you're making the difference that you used to. So I think we have a couple of policy responses to this, and resources and funding are clearly one of those as well. To a certain extent, you can compensate for poor working conditions by paying people more as well. And it's not the case that in some of the banks, for example, that they work short hours and aren't under incredible scrutiny, but they pay them huge amounts of money and people make that trade-off. Whether we've got enough money to make that trade-off for all of the teachers in the system, I seriously doubt. And I'm also not sure it's a great use of the funding as well, when what we could be doing is looking at the working conditions, for example. And I do think we should weight resources much more significantly to schools serving disadvantaged communities. But I would love to be able to use those resources not for compensating for poor working conditions, but, for example, by being able to overstaff in these schools. If we could have more teachers in these schools, you could both do more instruction time for each individual pupil and more planning and preparation and more pastoral care as well. You could spend more on training and development. These could be the sort of schools where you can launch your career and get the skills that you couldn't otherwise get, which would attract more people in there as well. So I think working conditions can align with funding to create the circumstances that we want. And it may be, I think, an irony of some aspects of our current accountability system that we're actually making the teachers in disadvantaged schools feel less effective and spend less time on teaching because they're worried more about scrutiny and constant change. So it could be having the opposite of effect of the high expectations that we're trying to build.
Thanks, Russell. And a slight challenge to accountability there as well, which is another key tenet what the OECD sometimes talk about. So Andreas, I wonder if you wanted to respond to some of those.
Yeah, thanks very much. Maybe I start with the last point from Russell. I think there's a tendency that we always have, when there's an issue, let's put, more teachers into this. I'm not convinced. The UK doesn't fare, badly internationally when it comes to the number of teachers per student. It doesn't fare badly when it comes to the overall investment in education. I do really believe this is a question of, how do we use space, time, people, and technology more effectively and more equitably? So I really think, the volume of resources, I think, is not something where I could see a very, very strong argument in the UK. And I want to also come back to a point that Andy made, and I have the same sentiment. I think one other response that we often have in education, okay, there's a problem, let's give teachers more training. Actually, there's probably few professions that get as much training, professional development than the teachers have. And actually, we have to acknowledge that the pandemic did more for teacher qualification and technology than 20 years of professional development. And it's really, I think, the work environment, what made people suddenly use the tools that existed long before. It was, a different kind of set of, environments. Suddenly it became part of the day-to-day work rather than an add-on that was sort of put on top of the system. I do think we need to think harder about the kind of work organization that actually gets people to do the kind of work that they can do best. The question of autonomy and equity, I think Sufyan made some really compelling points, and I think this is one of the hardest things for public policy. How we know that highly centralized education systems tend to be the most inequitable ones. That's the reality. They work strictly centralized, but they end up with very unequal distribution of resources. Total autonomy gets you to fragmentation and atomization in the system, which also is not inequitable. And I think the question really is, how do you balance autonomy with a kind of collaborative culture at the level of teachers, at the level of schools? Sort of how do you get the vertical and the lateral information flows and resource flows aligned? And I think this is something where some education systems do really, really well. I think again, if you take a system like Estonia, Shanghai, as a school you have incredible degrees of freedom, but actually you're never alone. You're always connected. Teaching is a kind of public, Julie, you made that point, a public kind of profession. You're always, visible to the system. Yeah, the judgment on you is not, what you do with the students in your class, but what impact you have on the system, how you actually work with colleagues, what contribution you make to the profession. I think this is something we need to think harder about. How do we link that professional autonomy with a collaborative culture? Second point, and very obvious, and as Sufyan, I think you alluded to this as well, is autonomy obviously needs to be related to performance. If you have a great school, obviously you can give that school a lot more discretion than if you have a school that needs more support, needs more guidance, and has fewer discretion. It's nice to have school boards, but if you are in a very poor district, that board probably is not going to help you a lot. So I think, again, student performance must be a key consideration when it comes to sort of autonomy. And the last point is really about autonomy and resources. This is in a way the part that is most easily amenable to public policy. And what I would say here is, I'm personally a great fan of the pupil premium. It's sort of, you can go in a very rigid way with formula-based funding. That's also a solution. You align the resources with the needs. To say, in a disadvantaged school, you get more and more of these resources. But actually, I think the pupil premium does something, really well. It gives the resources, but it puts the responsibility on their spending, on their use at the school. So you actually have some degrees of freedom at the school to think about, do I need breakfast clubs, or do I need more staff, or do I need more, help for parents or more tutoring and so on. And I think we need to find a good balance, how to use resources so that they really are enabling rather than, prescriptive. And but honestly, in our research, what we find is that it's often less about the financial incentives and more about, career incentives. What gets people to work in a tough school is not, a salary bonus necessarily, but you work together with great colleagues. You work with an environment that rewards good performance, that supports you well, that gives you access to resources. And I think this is something many education systems need to work harder. Again, we can only admire what happens in East Asia. They get this right. They actually ensure that teachers have those career incentives. And that's why the poorest schools are oversubscribed by the most experienced teachers. Everybody wants to work there, not because they get actually necessarily more money, but because it's just an amazing place to work.
Fantastic. All right, to the audience now. I see hands up already. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then give them to the panel. And we've got a roving mic, so we've got to the gentleman here first.
Ian Wigston, Brightfield Consulting. Question for Andreas and Russell, first of all. Do you have any evidence as to what makes teachers strong when looking at the percentage of teachers in any country who've done no other jobs and who come, as it were, up with what you might call a sort of a lifetime perspective of education? We run mentoring programs across the world, and particularly interested in sort of what your observations might be on English versus other country differences.
Thank you. Any other questions? And the lady over here, and then the lady at back.
Hello, Jen from Action Tutoring. I was particularly intrigued by the remark and the finding about teaching hours being a really clear driver of potential people outcomes. I'm intrigued by any reflections on whether that you think that needs to be classroom teachers clocking up those hours, or the likes of external bodies, tutors, or other working with schools.
Thank you, and the gentleman at the back.
Hey, Joe Hallgarton from the Centre for Education and Youth, but also a primary educator. Can I just ask, in terms of the data, are we talking about primary and secondary, or just secondary? If it's primary and secondary, are we noticing any differences in the data? If it is secondary only, can we please name that rather than make assumptions that what the data tells us about secondary is also true for primary?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I was hoping to come to Julian ask about early years as well, actually, because I think that's often neglected in these discussions, as is further education, which I don't know if you want to talk about at all, Sophie, but I think there's a question to Russell specifically. So maybe we'll go to Russell first and Andreas to talk about a couple of questions directed at him, and then the rest of the panelists.
Thank you. So I think the question was around teacher quality and teacher effectiveness and relation to other careers. As well. I certainly can't speak to other country experiences, so maybe Andreas can fill in on that one. At Teach First, we recruit people both directly out of graduate, but about a quarter of the people who join have other careers as well. And I don't particularly see noticeable differences in their effectiveness. Being edited out on that point. So I don't necessarily see lots of differences in performance, very different perspectives that people can bring. And I think schools are stronger when they recruit people from a wide range of backgrounds and levels of experience. I think one of the things that we've found at Teach First, which I think is echoed in other studies, it's very hard to find reliable proxies for whether someone is going to be an effective teacher or not. All of the sort of traditional indicators of credentials and qualifications and other things, they don't tend to play out in practice as much. Clearly, there are differences in teacher effectiveness and in the different performance of teachers, but being able to predict that a long way in advance before someone has entered the profession is really quite hard as well, which I do think has interesting implications then for being willing to take a risk on people, for not attaching perhaps some of the priority to some of the signals of potential that we might do in the past. And I think it also points very strongly to the importance of the environment in which someone learns to be a teacher and continues to practice their teaching as well. I think individual characteristics are important, but the culture of the school and what it can do with those characteristics is also vital.
Yeah, no, just putting this in an international context, I actually would credit the UK and England for its multiple inroads to teaching. I actually think Teach First is just a great example of that it's actually possible for people from different avenues to actually enter the teaching profession. And great people. What I would worry more about is that too many of them leave the profession, from your teachers. And I think this is not just about teaching financially not being attractive, but I do believe the key is teaching intellectually not being sufficiently attractive. And I think sort of the inroads, I think, are quite good. You have, a Teach First, but you look at the overall teaching distribution kind of direction is quite short, the teacher mobility. The question on the teaching hours is actually a really intriguing one. What is very clear from the data is that the more actual teaching students get, the more you can see better results. So I think we sort of in the classroom. That doesn't necessarily imply that, teachers should do little else than teaching. I would actually look at this the other way around. When I look at the highest performing education systems, typically they would have less other people in the school than you find in England, like teaching assistants. And they would give, therefore, their teachers a lot more responsibilities other than teaching. The teaching load would be a lot lower. you might have a larger class. That's true in some of the countries, not in all. But what is always true is that you have a lot more social responsibilities as a teacher. You spend a lot more time with teachers outside the classroom. You as a teacher do not just know your subject and how different students learn that subject differently, but you actually know your students. And I do think that's something that got a little bit lost in England because, you know, everything got tailorized. You know, you have a lot of different people with different professions in the school, a lot of assistants, and therefore teaching, the non-teaching working time that is actually quite important, got sort of driven out. And sort of teachers do no longer see that kind of holistic perspective on a student. They just, you know, focus a lot of hours on one thing, which is teaching. And it is not what we see in the highest performing systems. Yes, students get good learning time, but often it's provided by, you know, a multitude of teachers in different ways. And so I think I would look at this really, really carefully. I know there are different philosophies about it. You know, some people say a specialization, you know, like in a factory line gets you sort of more efficient working. Other people would say, no, actually, it's the holistic perspective of a teacher on the cognitive, the social and emotional needs of students that actually make a difference and that actually also make the job intellectually rewarding. Why do I say this? Comes from TALIS. When you ask teachers, you know, why did you get into the job? Most people wouldn't say, you know, to teach mathematics, but to help students, you know, grow in their lives. And I think that is got a little bit lost here. So, and the last question, very easy to answer. This is about secondary schools. We do have data from primary schools for a number of countries, not for all. And but what you saw here is just secondary.
To come to Julie next. I don't think that should stop you from reflecting on early years and primary. They're here.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. I think important work that you guys did actually at EPI on the disadvantage gap and how it grows over time really points to the importance of when you get to secondary. I mean, there's already a really big, especially in this country, a very big disadvantage gap for students who come from lower income backgrounds. And if you go down to primary, it's a bit smaller. If you go down to the early years, it's even smaller. So I really believe very, very strongly that more needs to be done to target the early years to ensure that students at that level, pupils, children, get, you know, the support that they need, especially in those lower income neighborhoods and contexts. And I think when we think about staffing, when we think about staff shortages in primary, secondary schools, it's even worse in the early years, especially after the pandemic right now. And so the study that I referred to earlier that did the discrete choice experiment in teachers, this was for primary, secondary level with RAND colleagues. We're actually exploring a collaboration right now to do this study in the early years as well, to better understand what, you know, motivates staff members to become teachers in the early years, to retain them and to try to get quality staff as well in the early years as well. And the OECD now has a great extension of TALIS in the Starting Strong survey, which I think is a great source of data to help us understand better exactly some of the questions we're talking about today. And you know, I think, Andreas, it would be great to see some more made out of those data. We hear less about the early years data, that the TALIS early years. There's fewer countries that participate in that, but I think it's still very valuable. So.
Which question, sorry, do you want me to respond to?
You can respond to whatever questions you like. I just assume you might want to reflect further education work.
Yeah, I think both further education and primary. I think with the colleague who spoke about primary, again, probably coming from an EAL background and seeing a country like the UK that has that diverse population, that has people coming within the education system from an EAL background, unless you plug the gap very early on, unless the investment and unless the teaching and the quality of teaching is right at the very early stages, there's a chance that gap will only continue to grow a lot more. What we find is EYFS typically doesn't have the same level of training and development around it. We only now trying to come about with the new MPQs around EYFS being released to try and develop staff to a equal standard within that sector. So again, for me, it's about more equity around the development of those that are dealing with our young people very early on, so that things like early reading, if we keep talking about reading and as an indicator of outcome and performance, and intellectual ability of young people. If the early reading isn't right, we know that that will only further compound itself later on as they grow up and get older. Again, on the other side, I think the part that really stands out is that within the UK, again, my own experience, having worked in the FE for 13 years in the FE system, is that the FE system, again, due to the way the FE system in this country is funded by comparison to secondary education, it means that it actually loses out on the stronger teachers within the system, and the younger teachers that are coming, or newer teachers to the profession, tend to opt in to work within the secondary system, which pays better career opportunities, more chance of progression than there are within FE, and therefore the quality of education in FE, again, this is speaking anecdotally and from my own experiences, is distinctly different within the FE system, and therefore what you don't find is that progression of they're performing really well, and it probably doesn't really matter if it's affluent or not affluent. Probably private sixth forms do really well, but typically when you go into FE, especially non-academic vocational, it curbs off the quality of teaching. Therefore, that progression into higher education doesn't come from a really strong base, which it should and could. So we kind of miss between 16 and 19, that quality of education is often not spoken about and missed out.
Okay, a couple of observations. Jen asked me to speak a little bit to the wider dynamics. We work very broadly across public service within my business, and one of the that mindset of thinking about things holistically is incredibly important across social policy. So we're increasingly seeing that those elements of government that are being proactive and preemptive are far more effective than those that are being reactive. So, for example, less police on the street, better crime prevention. Less nurses, better health. And in the case of education, thinking holistically about trying to get those learners to arrive in a place where they are well fed, they are not concerned about their safety, and they feel that they've got a secure home background, will make life much easier in terms of guaranteeing attendance and in terms of having better discipline in the classroom. So these things are all connected, and thinking about wider public policy is important. In terms of that, we talked about teaching time. We didn't talk about attendance. Attendance is a massive problem, particularly at FE, and it is an area where the research is very poor. The techniques on maximising motivation to attend are lots of different techniques out there, but the research on what really works is very poor. And I'd encourage those of you in this room who are interested in an interesting challenge is to go and research how you can drive up attendance, because again, that makes a massive difference to teaching time. The other area I think there's a huge opportunity ahead of us is the opportunity to drive down bureaucracy. If I talk to anybody in the teaching sector at any level, their biggest frustration is that they spend too much time on the paperwork and not enough time in front of students. With what's going on in terms of digitization today, and the opportunity for us to connect processes digitally, we should be able to focus on really holistically reducing the workload of bureaucracy on teachers and on head teachers, and that will make a massive difference out of available teaching time.
Fantastic, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Someone extremely fast with their hand there.
Thank you. Possibly looking too keen with the hand there. My name is Ros McNeil. I'm Director of Policy at the National Education Union. What an interesting debate, really struck by the recognition that in England we're not retaining enough teachers, and Andreas has already touched on that. And I thought Julie's challenge to us about how within each school those really thoughtful reflections about collaboration and how we lever, to use your phrase, how we lever excellent quality across the school and what that collaboration looks like, which linked us to what Russell was saying about the intensification of workload and teachers saying very clearly we're not able to have the flexibility to allocate our time on the activities, the priorities that we think are the most important for outcomes for children. So Andreas, you said at previous presentations, knowledge is very sticky. It's very hard to move around the system, what good practice looks like. How do we get the system? And you also said something, I think, this morning, which is absolutely essential about the triangulation, about us looking at student outcomes really relentlessly, but we triangulate into that the teacher perspective and what teachers are saying and what they value. And we look at that in terms of national teacher policy. So do you feel as panelists at the moment, are we valuing that teacher perspective? Are we listening and bearing that in mind about what teachers themselves are saying? What they've said, I think, coming out of COVID is this huge expertise, commitment, dynamism, innovation in the profession. How do we unleash that for pupil outcomes, because it matters? But how do we do that? Are teachers valued? Are we giving them a voice in national teacher policy? I also thought it was fantastic that we had those really key points about wider public policy, that yes, we have to distribute experienced teachers across the disadvantaged schools, but we need less disadvantaged kids as well, don't we? We have to say that. We can't just be distributing kids, distributing the teachers. So I thought the comments about wider social policy, fantastic, and essentially, I think it's hugely legitimate and valid that we make those connections across policy areas. So my question is, are teachers valued? How do we do that triangulation in national policy to bring those insights in, to unleash that expertise so we can be innovative, but so that teachers do also feel valued in this huge challenge we face post-COVID? Thank you for allowing such a detailed question.
Thank you. That's a wonderful comment and question, Russ. So we have only a few minutes to go, 3 or 4. So I might start with, I'll work all the way back to Andreas. Each panelist has less than 1 minute to summarise how they would value teachers and encourage them and keep them in schools where there's a particular challenge.
So just to flesh out from your point, I think we have a significant problem in our system that we measure results without measuring the inputs that are required to create those results, which creates a sort of heroic culture of demanding more without looking at the price that's being paid for that. And I think there are 3 ways that we ignore significant costs in the system. One is to teachers themselves, that we burn teachers out as a result of that. And yes, we should value that because that's a common good that we require for future generations of students as well. I also think that we sometimes ignore the cost that students themselves are asked to pay as well, by, for example, narrowing the curriculum towards what is measured in the league tables or creating hothouse cultures in schools as well. We also ignore sometimes the costs that some schools force onto other schools in their neighbourhood through techniques of, say, covert or even overt selection and off-rolling as well. And generally what that means is that we're able to constantly ratchet up our expectations of results without investing in the kind of key areas of collaboration, teacher development and student welfare as well. And it can sometimes mean that we have the wrong role models in our system of people who can achieve exceptional results, but they're in effect burning through the common good and the common resources that we all possess. And those results cannot be replicated system-wide. So I think if we did start to measure some of those elements of it, we might then start to think that we have different role models in the system and that there are schools which achieve exceptional academic results, but the teachers grow and develop, the students have a broad experience, and they work with the communities as they find them rather than manipulate their intake to make it look good.
Thank you, Russell. Again, probably following on from Russell's point, I think one of the questions that really stands out to me is when we're looking at performance, we're assuming normally that high performing schools, high outcomes means that teachers must be happy and that's why they're performing well. It's about looking at the retention of teachers in those high performing schools. Often actually teacher burnout happens at some of the higher performing schools where it's like a treadmill. They go in, they last a couple of years and they fall off that treadmill. How are we addressing some of those that are our highest performers? How are we understanding and listening to them? I don't think we generally do listen a great deal within the profession. I think some of the points Andy made around reducing bureaucracy, very similar to what's been going on with the police, let's get more bobbies on the beat, let's get them out in the streets, let's get them talking to people is the mantra we've been saying about the police. But very much so what we need to do is get teachers teaching, get that instruction time, get them spending time with young people instead of spending hours and hours of marking. And those that are sharper tend to mark in class, because actually why waste all your whole weekend if you've got really great weather outside? So that instruction time is being lost from the children. So how can we help reduce that bureaucracy? And some of the things that multi-academy trusts, whether we like them or not, really strong multi-academy trusts take away the bureaucracy in aspects of leadership, where they're taking away finance and human resource and IT infrastructure and catering, allowing head teachers to be head teachers of teaching and learning. And hopefully that should create a culture of teaching and learning is the focus, and systems and investing in systems that allow for marking, feedback and assessment to take place effectively should be a way that we look to drive things forward.
A risk of making a very contentious point. Do we value our teachers? We spend a lot of time talking Department for Education because we're running a lot of programs in the DFE. And what I can tell you definitively is that the senior civil servants in the Department for Education really passionately care about teachers' time. And I know that because they give me a really hard time about making sure the systems we produce put as the absolute minimum burden on teachers you possibly can. So I think people are trying, but I think there's a huge amount of opportunity ahead of us.
I think the question about whether teachers are valued is a really interesting question. It's a question that TALIS asks teachers directly. What TALIS doesn't do is ask other stakeholders, the parents, the students, the wider society. And I think that triangulating that is also something that would be really interesting. Now, I think looking at turnover, and especially turnover of teachers in the first 3 to 5 years of their careers and how high that is, I think does point to some serious issues with regards to how they feel valued, burnout, and all of that. I think we're running a little bit out of time, and I don't want to speak too much, but I think there's a really wider question there, and it's about the wider society. And I think we touched on it a little bit earlier as well. That the support needs to come from outside as well for teachers and appreciation of their work.
Thank you. Yeah, on the valuing of teachers, I do believe that teachers are valued for teaching. I think the bigger question is whether they are valued as professionals. Let me just contrast this with an area where I think the UK does so extremely well. If you look at your academic sector, you have people working in the academic sector relentlessly publishing papers. They're not paid for those papers. They do this because they're going to be recognized. They're going to be famous for this. They're going to contribute to their profession. They are the experts. We don't do that in the education profession here in the UK. We say, oh, we have real experts, in the government or in the universities who write the curriculum and all of this. You can just teach. And I think that's where the source of the problem is. I think we need to sort of move more towards valuing teachers as, taking ownership for their professional practice. And that brings me to the question of bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is rarely the cause. It's usually the consequence of the way we work. I think the weaker your lateral kind of knowledge flows and structures for collaboration are, the more you have, end up managing mistrust in the system, and that is, creating vertical kind of systems with a lot of kind of reporting requirements. I do think, you cannot cut bureaucracy without changing that culture, and I think that's really the sort of, I would invert, cause and effect on that. But I do believe, I think, and it comes back to what do we expect teachers to do? Is their job just to deliver a, curriculum? Or is their job, to take ownership of, the development of learners and the development of the instructional system? I think that will determine ultimately how teachers feel valued as professionals.
Well, thank you so much. We're coming to the end of the sitting down and listening part of this now, which probably all very relieved about. But we've had such fantastic contributions from everyone. There hasn't been an outbreak of complete agreement, which is wonderful on a panel. So I hope you'll join me all in thanking our panelists with a round of applause for it. And I think, if anything, this shows how incredibly timely this report is. Closing the gap is such a big issue. We're focused on this at EPI as our entire mission, and it's so reassuring that there are other people so incredibly talented and knowledgeable who are all of you and our panelists here who are also working on this topic. I'm sure we'll be talking about this a lot more in the years to come, but events like this don't happen without a lot of support. So I want to thank Capita for hosting us here, Andreas for coming along, presenting the work, and especially the team at EPI and Capita who've made this event happen. Helen and Becky, congratulations and thank you to all of you. And now I believe there are more croissant and coffee, aren't there, Andy? So please do go and dig in. Thank you so much.